Hello there everyone, your fluffy armchair Admiral Latter is back with some more hot ship action. In today's episode of Lots of Guns series about Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, we are going to talk about Iron Duke class Dreadnought battleship. A series of 4 ships built for Royal Navy before First World War. They were the most advanced British battleships at the outbreak of the war, though they were soon surpassed by Queen Elizabeth class. 3 out of 4 Iron Dukes took part in Battle of Jutland against High Seas Fleet. Later, demilitarized under the terms of London Naval Treaty, with last of Iron Dukes scrapped in 1946. Let's now build our Iron Duke class battleship. But before we do that, we need to set up our custom battle. And this time we need to set it up as follows. British Empire needs to start in 1924. This is because we need an access to the hull that becomes available for British Navy only in 1924. When it comes to rest of the technologies, we are going to use technologies that are normally available in 1914 to make the battle much more even. We are going to build 4 battleships to actually represent each of the battleship that was part of this class, and we are going to face against German battleships in the count of 4. So let's begin. At the very beginning we are going to select Dreadnought for hull. When it comes to its general characteristics, after naming it, we are going to set its displacement at 54,800, perhaps 56,800, perhaps 56,700. There we go. Tons, that's the minimum. We need the longest possible version of this hull. We can obviously crank it up to 62,000 tons, it doesn't really matter, as long as the hull is in its longest form. When it comes to speed, those ships were able to achieve 21.5 knots speed with her equipment or with her engines. When it comes to range, those ships could reach operational range of around 8,000 nautical miles, which was pretty average for those times. When it comes to bulkheads or amount of bulkheads, they were pretty standard, so there's not much to say about it. Let's go now to propulsion. So the ships used steam turbines that were taking steam from semi-oil fired boilers. Pretty much those were coal fired, while the coal was also covered in oil or soaked in oil, and that's how those boilers worked. So that pretty much generated some extra heat and helped fire those boilers more efficiently. When it comes to boilers themselves, we are going to use induced boilers in order to bring our engine efficiency to 100% when we start building that ship. Let's go now to auxiliary engines. So for power generation and auxiliary power or auxiliary propulsion, those ships used diesel engines, so that is auxiliary engine 2. I get no information about shafts, but at least shaft 1 seems to be appropriate. When it comes to armor, we are going to use crab cemented armor, which was pretty much very popular at that times. When it comes to barbette thickness, they were 10-inch thick, which I consider pretty heavy for those times, and that's what we are going to select. When it comes to torpedo protection, those were really basic. Nothing specific happened with Iron Duke class battleships. They had some torpedo protection bulkheads, they had torpedo nets, at least at the beginning when they were commissioned. However, they didn't had torpedo bulges, which is a slightly different system. They were supposed to be installed during late refits. However, those plans were scrapped as soon as London Naval Treaty went into place and caused all 4 ships to be demilitarized. But we will mention about this later. Ships had single hull bottom, or at least I haven't got any information that they had anything more than single hull bottom. When it comes to bulkheads, those were watertight, and that means we are going to use reinforced bulkheads too, because those are the only watertight bulkheads that are in the game. Anti-float system ships of this class had pumps. They were able to pump out the water. They were able to counter the list if some compartments were flooded by pumping water to different compartments, and they were also able to pump out the water completely of the ship. So we are going to use anti-float 2 in order to achieve such goal. I'm not sure about efficiency of those pumps, but we are talking about World War I technology, so I wouldn't expect anything super. When it comes to Citadel, as every other ship of this and preceding class, which were Orion and King George V class, they were protected by armored citadel, or ship's vitals were protected by armored citadel. So that's exactly what we are going to use for our build. Let's go now to armament. So when it comes to shells, they were pretty standard. I won't be using any heavy or super heavy shells for this build. I won't use extended magazines or extended magazines for torpedoes, which were present on that ship anyway. As a propellant, typically for British Navy or for Royal Navy, I am going to use corded. As we are talking about World War I ship, we are talking about corded 1. So that is exactly what I'm going to select. I'm not going to touch anything around turret traverse or reload, even though these guns could fire about 2 shells a minute, or up to 2 shells a minute, which probably our guns won't be able to. I won't be equipping this ship with any automatic system. And finally, when it comes to armament, one last thing that we need to select is torpedo size, because they were 533mm or 21 inch, at least on the original or actual Iron Duke. When it comes to equipment, we are talking only about rangefinders, and British Navy used coincidence rangefinders at that time. For our build, I am going to use rangefinder 3. However, rangefinder 2 might also be appropriate for that build. It will slightly reduce the accuracy though. Right, let's now move to armor values. So ships were protected by 12-inch belts that tapered down to 4-inch towards bow and stern. When it comes to deck, that was one of the biggest downsides of this class of the ship. They were protected by 2.5 inch of armor in the thickest section, and the thinnest section was protected only by 1 inch of armor. So that's what I'm going to set. When it comes to conning tower, it was protected by 11 inch of armor, so I don't need to touch anything. And turrets were protected by 11 inch as well, with turret tops going down to 3 inch. When it comes to secondaries and casemates, I couldn't find any information about it. However, ships at that time were relatively thin armored in that section. So we are talking about armor of 2 up to 3 inch thick. So I will select 2.5 inch for that build. Right, so now it's time to put all the equipment on top of that deck. So we are going to start with main tower. That will be advanced tower 12 for the purpose of this build. And as for secondary tower, we are going to use rear tower 9. We are going to place them on first snapping point and last snapping point respectively. When it comes to funnels, I'm going to use tall funnels in the count of 2 or 2 of these to make it simpler. We need to turn them by 90 degrees and install 2 of them on our or on back of our superstructure, and that is pretty much the base of our warship. And when it comes to main guns, the ship was originally equipped with 10 13.5-inch guns mounted in 5 double turrets along ship's center line, with 2 turrets in super firing position at the bow of the ship, 1 turret amidship and 2 in the super firing position at the stern of the ship. Unfortunately, we don't have any 13.5-inch guns in the game. However, we can always use 14-inch guns, so that is exactly what I'm going to use for the purpose of this build. So let me just quickly install these guns. Okay, and that looks good. Perfect. So when we got our guns installed, another thing that we need to install on that ship are secondary armaments. So those consisted of 12 6-inch casemate guns mounted primarily at the front casemates, with 8 guns pointing to the front and 4 guns pointing to the rear of the ship. So let's just install those. So our front casemates will be these 4 pairs. As for rear ones, it's gonna be those 2 pairs, and that's pretty much solves our casemate issue. Finally, the ship had 2 secondary guns mounted on a rear superstructure. Unfortunately, I can't put anything in there, but I can always install those guns right next to it. Just find a good spot. There we go. Let me just quickly turn this gun around. Beautiful. And finally, the ship had 4 underwater torpedo tubes, 2 on each broadside. Unfortunately, due to lack of snapping point, I'm going to use a pair of broadside ones, 1 at the bow and 1 at the stern of the ship, and that pretty much makes it a 4 torpedo launchers. And that is it when it comes to build of that warship. We are now ready to begin the battle, and let's just do it. While the battle is loading, I'd like to encourage you to smash that subscribe button. It really helps my channel grow. Also, it will let you use that bell button to get reminders every time I upload a new content. And finally, don't forget to leave your comments down below. Let's now talk about history of those ships. First ship of this class, named Iron Duke, was laid down on 12 January 1912 at Her Majesty's Dockyard in Portsmouth. 3 remaining ships of the class, Marlborough, Benbow, and Emperor of India, were laid down the same year in Devonport, Glasgow, and Barrow-in-Furness dockyards, respectively. All 4 ships were commissioned into active duty between 10th March and 10th November 1914. After being commissioned, Iron Duke and Marlborough were assigned to join Home Fleet. Not for long though, as right after the outbreak of First World War, they were assigned to 1st Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet. Benbow and Emperor of India were commissioned after outbreak of the war, and thus they immediately joined the 4th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet. Grand Fleet operated at North Sea in late 1914 and throughout entire 1950. Fleet conducted multiple sweeps in search for German fleet. Entire fleet also took part in multiple gunnery practices and other training exercises throughout that time. Luckily or not, apart from single incident involving loose oil tanker that collided with Iron Duke and sank, all ships in the class saw no action nor sustained any damage until 31st of May 1960. On that day, Iron Duke, Marlborough, and Benbow took part in battle that will later be known as Battle of Jutland. At around 1815, the Admiral John Jellicoe ordered the Grand Fleet to turn, effectively bringing it into the battle. At around 1817, Marlborough fired first salvos against a group of German Kaiser-class battleships. She then joined the group of battleships battering German light cruiser Wiesbaden. However, after firing 5 salvos, a premature detonation occurred in her front gun, disabling it. She continued to engage the cruiser with her remaining main guns supported by secondary battle. During that engagement, German cruiser launched a torpedo that found their way to target and at around 18:15-7 struck Marlborough amidship at the starboard side. It forced some of the boilers to be extinguished and the ship had to slow down to 16 knots. Torpedo also tore a 8.5-meter hole in the hull and caused massive flooding. Marlborough continued fighting and re-engaged with German light cruiser Wiesbaden and neutralized it. She then shifted fire to the König-class battleship Grosser Kurfürst, scoring 3 hits. She also fired 2 torpedoes. However, they missed their target. After both fleets disengaged later that day, Marlborough, with rest of 6th Division, turned south in an attempt to cut off German fleet. However, damage from the torpedo hit earlier on forced her to turn back and return to port for repairs. Iron Duke opened fire at around 18:30 at German Dreadnought SMS König, scoring 7 hits and causing heavy damage. Later during the battle, she shelled destroyers operating nearby German light cruiser Wiesbaden that got damaged earlier during the battle. She eventually sank, or at least got credited for sinking German destroyer SMS S-35. Later, fleets disengaged and Iron Duke saw no further action during the battle. Benbow suffered from poor visibility and therefore her gunners fired less frequently at the start of the battle. She then helped to defend against German torpedo boats and operated nearby crippled German light cruiser Wiesbaden. Later, she also opened fire along other battleships at different group of German torpedo boats that were making an attempt to fire torpedoes at British battle line. 4 hits were scored, but because there was a confusion caused by amount of ships that fired at those torpedo boats, no credit could be given. Shortly after, fleets disengaged and Benbow saw no more action during this battle. Emperor of India was not available during the battle as she was going through her scheduled refit. After the battle, many ships of the Grand Fleet, including Iron Duke, Marlborough and Benbow, received searchlights to improve night fighting capabilities, funnel caps to reduce smoke interference and flying off rams on B&Q turrets. After the war, all 4 Iron Dukes were transferred to Mediterranean Fleet. In 1990, ships of the fleet were supporting White Russians in Russian Civil War. Iron Duke and Benbow were stationed at Novorossiysk, and their task was to patrol and support White Russians near Yalta and Sebastopol. Marlborough took part in evacuation of what's left of Russian imperial family. A month later, she was testing new high-explosive 6-inch shells with the assistance of kite balloon used to spot splashes. Later that month, a shell broke up in one of the front turrets, causing minor damage. Emperor of India bombarded Bolshevik forces and railway outside Theodosia, and in 1920 she provided fire support for retreating White Russian forces near Novorossiysk. Shortly after Allied intervention during Russian Civil War, a new crisis in Mediterranean emerged, the Greco-Turkish War. Ships of the Mediterranean Fleet were concentrated near Constantinople to support the Greek invasion of the city. Between late 1920 and mid-1922, Marlborough, Benbow, and Emperor of India went through refits, during which additional rangefinders were installed. In 1930, London Naval Treaty was signed. According to it, all 4 Iron Dukes were to be scrapped or demilitarized. Benbow was decommissioned and sold for scrap the following year. Marlborough and Emperor of India were used as target practice and provided priceless information about ship defenses and armor. And Iron Duke, well, she was refitted and some of her guns and belt armor were removed. She was then recommissioned as artillery training vessel. During Second World War, Iron Duke, who was the last remaining vessel of her class, was used as a base ship and a floating anti-air platform at Scapa Flow. On 17 October 1939, she was bombed by Luftwaffe and had to be beached by her crew to prevent her from sinking. While the ship was still beached, she was attacked again in March 1940 during another Luftwaffe airstrike and was badly damaged. She was later camouflaged and briefly used as a decoy, which is believed to force Bismarck to take route to the Atlantic through Denmark Strait, which resulted in her being located by Home Fleet and later sunk. Later during the war, the ship was eventually repaired and returned to service as a harbor ship, even though she still remained beached. She survived until the end of the war and remained in Royal Navy until 1946, when she was sold for scrap while still being beached in Scapa Flow. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed. Please consider to bombard that subscribe button, use the bell afterward, and don't forget to sink some comments down below. Have a great day and see you all later. Latur, out.